Europe was warned that the Mongols were coming. In fact, it was foretold in prophecy. In his 1213 encyclical Quia Major, Pope Innocent III identified the head of the beast of the apocalypse with the religion of Islam and interpreted the number 666 as the number of years it was destined to exist. Islam's time, he said, was coming up. The papal legate Pelagius, heading to join the Fifth Crusade, was given a text by the Christians of Syria, prophesying that Islam would be destroyed by a powerful Christian ruler who would strike at the same time as the king of Abyssinia launched a campaign for Mecca from the south. Pelagius originally identified this Christian ruler as the king of Georgia, but news arrived of an invincible army moving westwards and laying waste to the Muslim world, led by a King David. He asserted that this great ruler was the true subject of the prophecy. The stories told in these reports were very confused, but they contained information about the Mongol destruction of Khwarezm, which was mistakenly linked with Kushluk's takeover of the Karakatay and the Khwarezmian raid on Iraq in 1217. The news was received with cautious excitement by the Westerners, who were hopeful that their actions in the Crusades had encouraged help from the East. But it wasn't long afterwards that darker news started to arrive. In 1223, Rusudan, the Queen of Georgia, wrote to Pope Honorius III apologizing for her failure to send reinforcements to assist the Crusaders, explaining that her lands had been ravaged by invaders from the east. The King of Hungary also sent word of Mongol attacks on the Rus and the Cumans. One chronicler asserted that King David had brought with his army savage, cannibal tribes that ate Muslims. Another blamed the attacks on the Georgians and the Rus being the wrong kind of Christians, or called them divine punishment for becoming too friendly with Muslim powers. In his annals, Aubry of the monastery of Trois-Fontaines recognized that these newcomers were not Christians or Muslims at all. He speculated that a great Christian king had led them west, but that they had revolted against him and killed him, and that they are now on the loose. The picture grew even more frightening in the 1230s. According to Matthew Paris, a group of Muslim princes sent an embassy to France and England in 1238 to plead for assistance against the Mongols. Rusudan of Georgia sent a plea for help to the Pope in 1239 after the Mongol general Chormagan seized eastern Georgia and conquered Samtskhe, even hinting that he might be willing to reunite the Georgian and Catholic churches in return for aid. A year later, the Pope's reply arrived. He regretfully did not have the means to help the Georgians militarily, but he was very happy to help bring back the Georgians into his fold, and he sent a delegation of Dominican friars for this purpose. A Hungarian Dominican named Julian travelled to the supposed ancestral Hungarian lands in the Urals in 1237, where he found the people had recently submitted to the Mongols. Returning through Suzdal, he discovered that the city had captured 2 envoys with a letter for King Bela IV of Hungary demanding his submission. Writing a report for the papal legate, Julian wrote about his belief that the Mongols intended to conquer Hungary, and their arrival marked a new, terrifying threat to Christendom. Emperor Frederick II is also said to have received a letter from the Mongols demanding his submission, but he dismissed it. The Khan supposedly urged Frederick to come to his court and take up a position there. Frederick, a connoisseur of hunting with birds of prey, remarked that he would make a very good falconer. 41 Mongol armies swept into Central Europe. One destroyed the city of Krakow and annihilated the Polish and Silesian armies at Legnica. Another raided Moravia, and another probed its way down the Vistula and the Odera. They destroyed Breslau, and they united with another force crossing the Carpathians. Then the united army descended upon Hungary. King Bela IV had tried to fortify the borders in advance, but he had begun his fortification efforts too late, and the defenders could do nothing to halt the invading armies. Bela's strained relationship with the country's nobility did him no favours in trying to raise an army and organise the kingdom's defence. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian forces were crushed and the king fled. The Mongols sacked Buda and the kingdom's capital of Esztergom, though they did not manage to take the city's stone citadel despite their best efforts. In the spring, the Mongols withdrew. The king had survived, but large parts of his country had been devastated. Understandably, the papacy wanted to better understand the Mongols and their motivations. A refugee clergyman from the Rus named Peter arrived in Western Europe and provided the Pope and his cardinals with lots of new information. He gave them an awe-inspiring account of Mongol military power, also told them that the Mongols were respectful of embassies and treated them well. He may have been working as the Mongols' agent in Europe and saying exactly what his masters wanted him to say. Encouraged, the Pope decided to put together embassies to travel to the Mongols. 3 in total were dispatched in 1245. One was led by the Franciscan friar Giovanni di Pian di Carpine. This group travelled from Breslau to visit the camp of Batu Khan by the Volga. After visiting Batu, di Carpine went on to Mongolia itself, where he saw the enthronement of Goyog in 1246. he carried 2 letters from the Pope, one calling on the Mongols to stop attacking Christians, and the other introducing the main concepts of Christianity and encouraging the Mongols to accept baptism. Guyog Khan took the embassy as an act of submission, and gave Dikapane a letter to take back to the Pope demanding that he come in person to pay obeisance and discuss matters further. When Dikapane returned, Europe was excited to hear his story. He wrote an account of his travels, the Historia Mongolorum, consisting of 9 chapters where he discusses the geography of the Mongol Empire and the customs, history and religion of the Mongols, but also their way of war. Let's take a closer look at his description of Mongol warfare. Dikapane begins by introducing a system of decimal organization. The basic unit of the Mongol army was a unit of 10 men, called an arban. 10 arbans formed a yahun, 10 yahuns formed a minchan, and 10 minchans formed a tumen of 10,000 men. This same form of organization was reported by the Chinese author Zhao Gong in the 1220s. Dikapane mistakenly believed that this was an invention of Genghis Khan. In fact, decimal organization was substantially older than the Mongol Empire, and was well established among the Karaktai. Genghis may have picked up this system while fighting for Togrul Khan of the Kiryats. The word tumen caused some confusion. Dikapane translated it as tenebra, or darkness in Latin, which may result from confusion with the East Slavic word tima, which does indeed mean darkness, but is unrelated to the word for 10,000. Dikapane claims that if, during a battle, any of the unit of 10 flee, the rest are killed. If all members of the 10 flee, the rest of the 100 are killed, so the group must give way as one or not at all. He also claims that if any of the members of a unit go forward courageously and the others do not follow, the ones who stayed behind are killed. This level of ruthlessness seems unlikely and is unattested elsewhere, but the Mongol army was certainly very disciplined. The Persian historian Juvaini and the Syriac author Bar Hebraeus commented that no one could leave the 10, 100, or 1,000 to which they had been assigned on pain of not only his death, but also the death of the commander who received him. Dikapane then goes over the subject of weapons and armour. Each Mongol fighter carried 2 or 3 bows, or 1 good one, 3 quivers of arrows, an axe, and ropes. The wealthier soldiers had somewhat curved swords, a helmet, a cuirass, leg armour, and armour for their horses. Their cuirasses were made of laminated strips of hide laced together so that the armour was very bendable, and in fact the flexion of the body caused them to double or triple up, to provide even more of a barrier to attacks. The helmet was based on an iron or steel crown, though the rest of the headgear was made of leather. Some men carried hooked lances that they could use to drag enemies from their saddles. When it comes to the Mongol arrow, Dikapane describes it as 2 feet, 1 palm, and 2 fingers long. He notes that this may not be very useful without reference, since the length of a foot varies substantially, but fortunately he explains that 2 grains of barley make an inch, and 16 inches make a geometrical foot. Unfortunately, most people today don't have much of an idea of the length of a barley grain. I'll save you the trouble of looking that up and tell you that arrows were 80 to 100 centimeters long, a little more than longbow arrows of the time. Instead of being socketed, the arrowhead was forged with a sharp which was embedded into the harp of the arrows. The Mongols did have shields made of wicker or willow, but Dikapane believed that they only carried these while serving as bodyguards in the camp for the Khans or princes. He moves on to describing their strategy. While advancing to battle, Dikapane says, the generals stay away from the front line and move accompanied by men, women, or stuffed dummies and horses to make their numbers seem larger. They send out a battle line of captives ahead of their force straight at the front line of the enemy to hide their movements and cause disturbance. While hidden, they send troops to circle about towards the enemy flanks. He says they prefer to avoid fighting hand-to-hand before they have injured most of the men and horses of their opponent with arrows, after which they descend for the final blow. Should the enemy put up stubborn resistance, the Mongols might open up an avenue for them to escape. However, once bands of the enemy have begun to retreat along this path, horsemen will be there to capture or kill them. When they wish to take a fortress or city, Dikapane says that the Mongols would use mild words and grand promises to encourage the people to surrender. If they did so, the Mongols would ask them to line up so that they could be counted, and then they would separate out the craftsmen and those who they wanted to keep as slaves and kill the rest. This may have happened, but the massacre was not customary. It was reserved for cities that resisted or rebelled after being captured. After Jochi took the city of Jand in Khwarezm, he was said to have separated out the craftsmen, artisans, and keepers of hunting animals, and pressed the remainder into his levy. Different generals sometimes disagreed on how brutally to treat a city. During the siege of Urgench, the capital of Khwarezm, Georgi and his brother Chagatai had disagreed as to whether to preserve or destroy the city. If the city did not surrender, the Mongols would lay siege to it. Decarbony describes how they would encircle a fortified place and use siege machines and arrows constantly, day and night, preventing anyone inside from resting. They kept rest a luxury for themselves by dividing up the responsibility of the attack to different units so they could cycle fresh troops back into the siege whenever needed. He describes the Mongols using Greek fire to attack fortifications, and more dubiously, spreading the fat of human corpses to help set fire to buildings. Decarbony may not have known this, but Mongol siegecraft had been under constant iterations since their campaigns in China many decades ago. Their use of prisoners to construct rams, catapults, and ladders, and to dig tunnels under walls was pioneered in China. In their campaign against the Shishir, they dammed a river so it would flood the streets of the city of Yinchuan, though their tactic backfired somewhat when the waters also flooded their camp. By the time of the siege of Vladimir in 1238, the Mongols were conducting sieges with ruthless efficiency. So much for how the Mongols fought. The book's chapter 8 is about how to fight back. Decarbony tells us that the Mongols intended to conquer the whole world. Since they had already defeated everyone else, Christendom was next. He reports that a council was held during his time at the Mongol court, where the generals planned to launch an 18-year campaign into Europe, once again sending armies into Hungary and Poland. Again and again he stresses the importance of unity. If the Mongols are allowed to take one country at a time, he says, they will levy the men of each country they capture and use them to attack the next, in addition to the troops they gather from all over the empire. Thus, the Christian nations should form one body and create one plan of action between them. He discusses the best weapons to employ against the Mongol armies. He mentions how much the Mongols fear the crossbow. This weapon had performed well against them in Hungary and had much more penetrating power than self-bows. Bolt and arrowheads should be tempered in salted water, as the Mongols did, to improve their penetration even further. He advises cutting no costs when it comes to armor, given that your life is on the line. In general, he recommends that the Christian nations adopt many military innovations of the Mongols for their own, including the decimal system of organization, generals staying out of the front line, harsh discipline for those who withdraw without orders or start looting before the enemy is beaten. If it is possible to select a battlefield, he recommends a flat, open plain where visibility is greatest, so that the Mongols cannot use the terrain to conceal their movements or to lay traps. If Christian troops face a Mongol feigned retreat, they should not trace them far unless they can clearly see that there are no traps ahead and they have reinforcements close by. He explains that the Mongols will usually have the advantage in a chase because each warrior would march with several horses. After riding one for a day, he would switch his mount and allow the horse to rest for 3 or 4 days afterwards, ensuring none of them would be tired. He also stresses the value of scouts to detect any attempt to strike at the flanks of an army, giving the Mongol preference for encirclement. There should be squadrons on alert day and night who do not give in to looting even if given the chance, and must not ever rest too long in one place. He recommends a scorched earth strategy in front of the Mongol advance. Bury valuables and secret caches, and hide or burn fodder and straw. Cities should have strong defensive redoubts built to be resistant to catapults and volley fire. Each fortress must have enough supplies to last many years of siege with plenty of wood and water. If possible, he recommends constructing counter-catapults inside the fortress to neutralize the Mongol war machines. In battle, he describes how Mongol soldiers thrown from their horses still pose significant danger as they continue to shoot from the ground, so they should be quickly killed or captured. Mongol captives are valuable because they can be exchanged while making peace, or ransomed, since the Mongols were apparently very willing to give substantial ransoms to retrieve their captured soldiers. Finally, Decarbony notes that many of the peoples fighting with the Mongols might be turned against them if given the chance. The friars' call for unity was never put into action by the Christian nations. Of 5 crusades preached in the 1240s, only one targeted the Mongols, and it dissolved without ever making contact with their armies due to conflict within the empire. However, fictitious accounts of a great victory at the Danube spread through Europe and the Middle East. The Mongols did return to Poland in 1259, which was 18 years after the first terrible invasion, and sacked and looted many cities. Western chronicles made little comment, but according to a Polish annalist, the campaign was even more destructive than 1241. Lithuania, Thrace, Bulgaria, and Serbia were all targets of significant raids. From 1259 onwards, Berka Khan demanded a marriage alliance and military assistance from Bela IV of Hungary, but the Hungarian king ignored his letters, and Berke was in no position to carry out his threats due to strife within the Mongol Empire. Near the beginning of Lent in 1285, the Mongols under Nogai and Tole Buka, accompanied by their Halician allies, invaded Hungary in a two-pronged attack, only to find the country in a very different state than the first campaign had found it 44 years before. The country was caught up in a political crisis, so it may have seemed easy pickings, but the Hungarians were united in their opposition to invaders. King Bela had made many changes after the first invasion, and though he did not live to see them come in use, his successors profited from his foresight. In 1241, there had been only 10 stone castles in the entire Kingdom of Hungary, but now there were at least 76. King Bela had expanded the ranks of the nobility by including more members of the middle elite, and he had invited the Knights Hospitaller to help defend the country. He also sought to hire 1,000 crossbowmen from Venice. Lamellar armour, like that used by the Mongols, had become popular in Eastern Europe. It may have been the basis for the 14th century Western European brigandine. The Mongols found the countryside bare of resources and the population secure in fortified towns. Frustrated by the lack of success and the fierce harassment they were receiving from local troops, the Mongol forces withdrew in 1286 with little to show for their campaign. Tole Buka's forces were allegedly reduced to eating their dogs, horses, and unburied dead during the retreat, and only a few survivors were reported returning with him to Volhynia. Perhaps parts of this invasion story proved de Carpene right. Well, I was beaten to the punch a bit with this episode because Kings and Generals released their own short on exactly the same topic. I thought about whether I should continue with my video because it had already been in the works for about a week, and I decided to do so because I thought it had a lot more context and a lot more detail, so people who watch the other video might even be more interested in the topic and more willing to watch something more. So I've decided to post it, and we'll see how it goes.